Welcome, Aleksandar Hemon. In German cinemas, one could have just seen a film for which you wrote the screenplay, together with a director and a colleague of yours, Matrix Resurrection. But we want to talk about your new book in German, which may have something in common with the movie Matrix, namely the playful, confusing, spark-creating treatment of the familiar and the old. This light-hearted shaking of the reader begins with the unusual form of the book. It is actually two books. It has two titles, namely My Parents and All Not Your Own. And these two are quite different texts, one about your parents and the other about you as a child and adolescent. And the book also has two covers, one of a group of adults, the other of a child. Before we talk about the content, let's talk about the form. How did you get the idea to do such an unusual double book?
Well, I was writing the book about my parents, which I had under contract. I had written some parts of it and published them individually in magazines and journals. And then I was writing the rest of it. And as I was writing, a lot of these memories that are in the other book, which in English is This Doesn't Belong to You, the title is This Does Not Belong to You. A lot of memories that I could not stop thinking about from my childhood, because thinking about my parents triggered my remembering me as a child. And so I started writing them down. I didn't know what that would look like or what I would do with that. They were all fragments, very short, as they are in the book. And so I decided that once I have 100 of those, then I'll look at them and see if they could become a book. And when I did that, they held together pretty well. But then the problem was how to publish two books at the same time that are so similar and so close. And if they're not published at the same time, they will be too far apart because they're so related. And then we had an idea, my agent and my editor and I, that it was primarily my agent's idea to publish them as one book. That is one volume with two books in it. And there was such a perfect solution for the issue that I can't believe we hadn't thought about it from the beginning, from the very beginning. And that way, when whatever side of the book you start reading, you end up in the same place in the middle, which is where the pictures of my family and myself are. So that everything, however you read the book, it leads you to the same place.
You stop in the middle at the photographies there, and but then you have to close the book, turn it over and flip it. I mean, because the second part of the book is upside down. Wherever you start the book, the other part is upside down. And this standing on one's head, I mean, immediately makes a critic like me prick up his ears. I mean, it sounds like a good metaphor for the relationship between parents and son.
well, in some ways, yes. I think that as we grow old, we see our parents from different points of view, and I mean physically, right? I remember this clearly somewhere in the book, how much time I've spent looking down on the things that are on the ground, right? Looking toward, well, I was short because I was a kid, looking at things that were happening at my eye level, and the grown-ups and adults were way above me, right? Up there. Doing their stuff, right? And now I'm at that level. I know what grown-ups do, but then it's hard to see children down there, what they might be up to. And so there's this physical relationship that a child has with parents. I mean, we couldn't do that in a book. We couldn't really stack two books, two levels. But I think flipping it and suggesting that there's a particular positioning of a child in relation to parents is interesting, I guess.
For those people who have read your previous books, as I have, some of the stories and anecdotes you tell in this book look familiar. I mean, so whoever who's read the novel which made you internationally famous, Lazarus in German, the Lazarus Project in English, which is about immigrants from Sarajevo and life and death and life ongoing in a foreign country. Or let's say the novel Nowhere Man, or the autobiographical The Book of My Lives, or the story collections Love and Obstacles, or the thing with Bruno. And in fact, in all these titles and all these books of yours, you use your life as a quarry. And your parents appear again and again, and your father's bees, your mother's Sama, and something else. So the same happens to the stations of your biography. I mean, born in Sarajevo in 1964, that you were in the US in 1992 when the Yugoslav wars began, and then you remained in the US and struggled to make a living, and started to write in English after some years in lucid English, colleagues say of yours. Why did you start to write again about your parents and your first 15 years in such a concentrated way now?
Well, as I said earlier, I wanted to write about my parents because I knew that for a while, and I would tell these stories to my friends, and I wrote a few pieces. My parents, and not just my parents, but this what being a grown-up in the world means, they have a life philosophy, a worldview. They have understanding or belief, a system of beliefs and ideas as to who they are, how their life works, how the world works, and all the things that constitute a person. Their identity, their relation to the homeland, their relation to space. And so I was writing about these things and talking about them. But the thing that finally made me want to put that in a book, and it was the so-called migrant crisis in Europe, right? Which started, well, it was always ongoing, but in 2015, people started drowning in the Mediterranean and the borders were closed and so on. And the way that the migrants trying to get into Western Europe mainly were represented as a mass, as swarms. In fact, some British fascists and bigots use the word, including in the government, they use the word swarm to describe the movement of migrants, right? And there were posters in the UK. I would imagine Germany wasn't not available to see such images. They were always represented as a mass, right? Faceless, mindless. They were always represented as zombies, as people who just were driven by this hunger to get whatever it is that we have here or over there in Germany. And I knew, because I come from a family of migrants and refugees, right? I have friends and family all over the world. I have family in Canada, in Italy, in Sweden, in the UK, in Australia, in France, and so on. So we are scattered around the world. And I know that each of those people has a life, has a story of their life, has a family and people who love them, has thoughts, has ideas, has principles, has hopes, a whole human package, right? And so I obviously could not write about those people because I didn't know them, but I wanted to write about my parents, not because they're representative of all of refugees and migrants, but because I knew about them more than about anyone else. So I wanted to present them as thinking, complex people who have an extensive experience in life, including displacement and migration, moving from one country to another. They were about my age now, and I know how difficult it is to adjust at this age, and learning a language late in life and finding a way to live and thinking through the whole thing and being able to formulate it, to me at least. And so I wanted to write a book about that. And then, as I was saying, childhood memories emerge from that. They sort of crawl through the cracks, and I wanted to address that. So the books are different because the book about my parents is about my parents, and I feature there as a minor character. But the other book is a collection of memories and thoughts about the ways in which memory and remembering and oneself works. And that a lot of that is already covered, you're absolutely right, in my books. That is, if there's a central theme in my work, whatever the book is, it is displacement. and also with that, memories and what we retain from our previous life, what displacement does to one's self-conception, to the way one thinks of oneself and remembers oneself, and also bilinguality and all these things.
This meets my impression that the first part, my parents, is very respectful and affectionate, but also one hardly hears your famous mockery and sarcasm. I mean, it is a very serious book. It is very respectful to your parents, perhaps for the background you just mentioned.
Well, it is. I love them. I think that they're heroic people. What they did was not easy to do. It is incredibly difficult and traumatic to move from one country to another, and not, even if it's your choice, or let alone if it's not your choice, if you're a refugee. So just go where you can go, not where you choose to go. And so what they do, what migrants do, refugees do, it is a heroic endeavor. And what my parents did is also, it's extremely remarkable. And so, and I've always loved them. I mean, we had our own, children and parents. They always argue. We are a very outspoken family. We say what you think and talk a lot and argue a lot and all that. But I've always loved them. And I enjoyed writing the book. I enjoyed interviewing them for the book. I would sit down and have conversations with them. And in doing that, our relationship a little changed a little, because that might have been the first time in my life when I actually listened to them. I would ask them a question, and they would talk, and I would not counter their points. I would not argue with them. I would not try to tell something about myself or what happened to me. I just sat down and listened to them, and they enjoyed it too. And a lot of things opened between us. They told me things, not secrets, but they spoke about things with detail and care, because they had time. I wasn't interrupting them. That made me remember things and rethink things from our past, from our shared past, in ways that were, well, I guess loving, that they generated more love for them.
So I wasn't wrong when I thought, well, this is a book about foreignness. I mean, foreignness with a new environment, in exile, as far as your parents are concerned, and foreignness of oneself, in the case of the young Aleksandar in Sarajevo, because this foreignness encompasses all areas of daily life, including and especially the interaction with other people. You tell about that in the chapter titled Catastrophe, and you tell it in a whole lot of anecdotes and scenes. Is there something special about this chapter Catastrophe, which I like very much?
Well, I mean, it's very close to my heart. It is an important. It's one of the pieces that I wrote before I wrote the book. As I was writing about my parents, and I can't remember why exactly I wrote it, whether it was commissioned or I had an idea. But the concept of catastrophe is very important to me and my family and my people from Bosnia and the Balkans, because we live in a history that is marked and organized around catastrophes, wars and displacements and such things. And so we see the narrative of history and our own lives in terms of ruptures, interruptions, of breaks, and the biggest trauma in my particular life and my parents' life, although they're old enough to have experienced World War II, but they were just kids. The biggest trauma in our life is the war in Bosnia and our displacement. And so I realized and talked about this with my sister, who's a psychotherapist, more than once, even before she was a psychotherapist. We talked about the fact that we see the world that is really conceptualized around the possibility of catastrophe. That is, we constantly expect something bad to happen. And this doesn't paralyze us necessarily. It's a way of managing managing the future, if you wish, imagining what is coming at us individually and as a group of people, what is coming at us and what we can do to be ready for that. And so I think about it all the time, and I also have thought about it at the time of the pandemic. It's a good time to think about catastrophe, and also at the time of a general rise of fascism and racism and aggressive militarism all over the world, where I and my people I know from Bosnia were fully recognizing that in the United States we might be in the pre-war stage, right? That the big catastrophe is yet to come. And people are already thinking about what to do, where to go, how to live through that. And I obviously formulated some of those things in contrast to many Americans I know and admire and respect, and I don't know, who simply cannot imagine what is already happening, because their minds and their life experience is not organized around catastrophes, but organized around some kind of continuity, even if it's, imagined and fantastic continuity. They don't think in terms of catastrophes. They think in terms of, everlasting values or something.
Thank you very much. Let's hear a part of Catastrophe read by Aleksandar Radenkovic.
Mein Vater unterhält sich gern, stellt Leuten Fragen, lauscht ihren Geschichten und erzählt seine eigenen. Manchmal, wenn er neben mir sitzt, während ich lese oder fernsehe oder einfach nur ins Leere starre, kommandiert er: Rede. Erst sträube ich mich, doch dann gebe ich nach und am Ende erzähle ich etwas. Nicht nur, dass er ungern schweigt oder es nicht erträgt, wenn Menschen sich nichts zu sagen haben, nein, es ist vor allem seine Neugier, die im Alter nicht abgenommen hat. Er geht davon aus, dass jeder eine Geschichte zu erzählen hat, vor allem sein Sohn, der Profi-Geschichtenerzähler. Mein Vater erwartet von anderen, sich mit der Welt zu beschäftigen und glaubt, er sei dazu ausersehen, Fragen zu stellen und Gespräche zu führen. Das Schweigen ist der Tod des Geschichtenerzählens und somit der Liebe. 2007 reiste ich mit meiner Frau Terry und unserer neugeborenen Tochter Ella zum Weihnachtsfest nach Florida und meine Eltern kamen aus Kanada dazu. Terry und ich hatten im Frühjahr in Paris geheiratet. Damals hatten sich die Elternpaare kennengelernt und glänzend verstanden. Nun waren meine Eltern ein paar Tage in Pensacola Beach bei Terrys erweiterter Familie, die sich oft trifft und zig Tanten, Onkel, Cousins und Cousinen umfasst, dazu Freunde der Familie, die mit der Zeit einen Verwandtenstatus erworben haben. Meine Eltern merkten rasch, dass diese afroamerikanische Familie unserer bosnischen Familie sehr ähnlich war, was ihre Struktur und ihre Gepflogenheiten betraf, und das mochten sie sehr. Doch eines war anders. Terrys Familie tat nicht das, was meine Familie stets tat und bis heute tut: Geschichten erzählen. In ihr wird die Familiengeschichte nicht in Gestalt einer gemeinsamen mündlichen Erzählung überliefert. Als wir an einem milden Tag auf dem blendend weißen Sandstrand nach Fort Pickens spazierten, wo der große, von den freiheitsliebenden Vereinigten Staaten eingekerkerte Geronimo gestorben war und die Möwen unter spärlichen Baiserwolken über uns dahinsegelten, sagte mein Vater zu meiner Frau: Erzähl mir von deiner Familie, Terry. Welches Unglück ist euch widerfahren? Terry war entgegenkommend, konnte seine Neugier aber nicht ganz befriedigen. Denn abgesehen von dem unausrottbaren Übel des amerikanischen Rassismus, von dem ganze Bevölkerungsgruppen betroffen sind, konnte sie von keinerlei historischen oder familiären Desastern berichten. Mein Vater fand das verwirrend, ja enttäuschend. Denn wenn kein Unglück geschehen war, konnte es keine Geschichten geben. Wenn kein Unglück geschehen war, worüber sollte man dann reden? Wenn kein Unglück geschehen war, was war dann geschehen? Wie lautete die Geschichte der Ereignislosigkeit? Terry wusste natürlich, dass meine Eltern der Belagerung Sarajevos entgangen und als Flüchtlinge in Kanada gelandet waren. Sie wusste auch, dass die Hemons im Laufe ihrer Familiengeschichte viel Schlimmes erlebt hatten, zuletzt und als Allerschlimmstes den Krieg in Bosnien. Nichtsdestoweniger veranlasste mich die Frage meines Vaters, meiner Ehefrau, meine Eltern zu erklären, die theoretischen Grundlagen ihres Denkens zu umreißen und allen, die es hören möchten, darzulegen, wie traumatische Erfahrungen Welt und Wirklichkeit bis in die innerste Struktur hinein verändern können. Ich wusste sofort, warum mein Vater die Frage stellte. Ich kannte den dahintersteckenden Zwang. Unglück war ein anderes Wort für Katastrophe. Er bat Terry, die Geschichte ihrer Familie anhand der Brüche zu erzählen, die sie geprägt hatte, denn so erzählte er die Geschichte unserer Familie. Anhand der Kriege, der Wunden, der Vertreibungen, der Verluste, des Ringens, der Momente von Gefahr und Verzweiflung. Eine Geschichte ohne Katastrophe war für ihn undenkbar. Um eine Familiengeschichte zu erzählen, musste man von Schicksalsschlägen erzählen. Man umriss die eigene Stellung in der Welt anhand der erlebten Katastrophen. Und was man nicht erzählen konnte, das konnte auch nicht verstanden werden. Eine Familie, eine Welt, ein Leben ohne Katastrophen wäre unverständlich, ein Ding der Unmöglichkeit. Wenn die Katastrophe das dramatische Ereignis ist, das eine Handlung zum Abschluss bringt, dann könnte ihr Ausbleiben bedeuten, dass die Tragik nie endet. Anders gesagt, eine Katastrophe ist eine Falle, doch man kann ihr entrinnen, indem man von ihr erzählt. Wer das Glück hat, eine katastrophale historische Wendung zu überleben, der kann die Geschichte erzählen. Der muss sie erzählen.
Thanks to you, Aleksandar Hemon. So, catastrophes enable narration, whereas the normal life explains itself. Thanks to catastrophes, there's something to tell. But this doesn't apply to the United States, not to your North American wife, who reacts alienated to the Hemon family's enthusiasm for catastrophes. That makes me wonder. I mean, given the major catastrophes US people deal with in books and movies, climate change, the aliens attack, the violent home invasion by strangers, the loss of one's father. There's a lot of catastrophes in US life.
Well, they're in the movies, yes. Yes. The question is whether that is an exception, those catastrophes, or they're the rule, right?
Yes.
For us, they tend to be the rule. Something's always coming down upon us. Whereas for whatever reason, and to a large extent, because of the way that American culture works, the American culture is mainly entertainment. It's not necessarily a way to think through one's position in the world and history. And much of that entertainment is really just propaganda. And so catastrophes are seen as exception, as the Americans see themselves. I mean, not all of Americans, obviously, but American nationhood is seen to be exceptional. There's a notion of American exceptionalism, the idea that Americans are different from all the other nations in the world. And then if you're born or become an American, that you have access to a set of historical privileges, right, that other countries don't, right? Like, well, you can invade countries for one thing, just because, and have, people with all across the political range that seriously talk about, this being a chosen nation, America, and all that. So while there are catastrophes, the situation of America is not organized around those catastrophes, right? You could think of slavery as a catastrophe, but even slavery, particularly on the right wing, is seen as an exception somehow to this special value and character of America, right? And so in that sense, conceptually, it is different. Now, my wife is African-American, right? There's this calamity of American racism that never stops. It has never stopped. It might not stop for a while still. And so there's she and her family are well aware of that. But they also, that is in some ways already recognizable, right? From a lot of people of color and African Americans, it was always part of America. Even that is, as it were, stable, right? It didn't happen suddenly. American racism does not happen suddenly. Trumpism didn't happen suddenly, right? There's a logic to it. So there's a continuity. For whatever reason, we were surprised in Bosnia and Yugoslavia with what happened. It shocked us in many ways.
Okay, let's talk about the second part of the book. I mean, it has a strange title for me, All Not Your Own. It is explained in the book. Would you like to explain the central scene, where this title comes from?
Well, there's a passage in that book where I remember, as I always have, when I was suddenly beaten by, and speaking of shock and catastrophe, by this grown-up man, was an elderly man, my neighbor when I was a kid, because I was left behind by my friends who ran off to play, and I kicked the entrance door to the building, and this gentleman, this man, started beating me from behind. I didn't even see him, and because he kept saying, "This does not belong to you." That is, I was damaging public property. And so he kept hitting me and telling me, "This doesn't belong to you." And it is one of those memories, indelible memories, that I never quite could put in my fiction. It was too strong in some ways, and I never forgot it. It was a thing that I remember from my childhood because, I mean, I was scared, obviously. The man was beating me. I was maybe 10, if that. But it stands for this sense that I have, that wherever I am, whatever I'm engaging with, it doesn't belong to me. Once, I think it's a symptom of displacement. That once you're displaced from your home space, you cannot really go back to it. It doesn't really belong to you anymore. And then the new place also doesn't belong to you. And so I wanted to think through that and write about that.
There's a second scene which belongs to that title, I think, and to that first scene. Even as a child as well, the little Aleksandar throws a stone into a window pane, and afterwards, every time he looks at this unrepaired pane with a hole in it, he has to think, that is your own. This is the this is the second, and which is the other side of the medal. And I mean, to me, it's an example of your humor, but it's also a strong symbol for the whole book, I think. The child owns a whole. He has no fixed stock of things and even memories, or even memories that make up an identity. There's only a whole.
That's very interesting. Yes, I suppose that's what in that scene, I as a boy own is the rupture, if you wish, right? It's the break. That's the only thing you can own, right? Not the thing itself, but the breaking of the thing itself. And that aligns with the sense I have of being in the world, right? That I can only exist in spaces and times that are marked by ruptures, by breaks, by something being damaged.
But of that you tell in very vivid and very funny and witty anecdotes, huh?
Well, yes, I hope so. I hope so. I can't really, I mean, it's not that I have a philosophical position why things should be funny when I write them. I guess I just see life and the world as both funny and tragic. It's the comedy and tragedy simultaneously happening in the same place, in the same time. Of course, death is not comedy, but life is. And so as long as we're alive, there are possibilities and opportunities for joy and laughter and humor. Mm. It is also, I suppose, I think that's mentioned in my piece on catastrophe, to laugh at what might have happened to you, to laugh at things in the context of your struggles means that you have survived, so that you can choose how to, the register in which you will tell or remember such things. When I went to Sarajevo for the first time after the war, less than a year after the war ended, and talked to people who survived and were there, going through terrible times, and risking their lives, had no food to eat. Very often, unless they were talking about a loss, the death of someone they loved, very often they would tell those stories as funny stories. They would tell a story about how they had nothing to eat and would, get one potato which was wrinkled and then watch the potato because there was no TV and no electricity. They had nothing to do. Well, what's the point of eating one shriveled potato? And so they would tell this story about starving as a funny story, slapping their knees. That was so funny. And so it's not that I found it strange, but it was conspicuous. And the way I understand it is that means that they've survived. They can tell me the story after they have survived. And after that, starvation was, well, in the past. And then it was narratized too, so that narrative could be told and interpreted in a way that they choose. So the register shifted from tragic slightly to funny. And that was triumphant. There was an expression of being happy to be alive.
Yes. This survival is a good hint for the next reading. There's also a funny anecdote, part of a reflection on the relationship between man and world. In this chapter we now hear.
Gestern ging mir auf, dass ich komplett falsch lag. Absolut falsch. Und das von Anfang an, obwohl ich nicht sagen könnte, wo dieser Anfang lag und was damals seinen Anfang nahm. Nicht, dass alle Entscheidungen, die ich getroffen habe, falsch gewesen wären oder dass die Summe der falschen Entscheidungen jene der richtigen überwiegt. Nein, mir ging auf, dass der allererste Schritt ein Fehltritt gewesen war und somit auch alle folgenden, jedenfalls alle daraus resultierenden. An irgendeinem Punkt in meiner nebulösen Vergangenheit hielt ich eine falsche Grundannahme irrtümlich für die richtige, traf also auch die verkehrte Entscheidung. Ich weiß weder, worin sie bestand, noch kann ich den Moment verorten, als alles in eine falsche Richtung zu laufen begann. Aber ich nehme an, dass die irrige Grundannahme damit zusammenhing oder von Bedeutung dafür war, wie ich mir die Welt oder mein Leben vorstellte, dass ich irgendwann dachte, dies ist dies und das ist das und so werde ich sein und handeln und ich stand zu meiner Entscheidung und das war ein fataler Fehler. Dieser Punkt meines Lebens, an dem ich Grundannahme und Entscheidung für richtig hielt, könnte jeder Moment gewesen sein, in dem ich glaubte, so zu handeln, wie es mir entsprach und mir obendrein einbildete, es gäbe eine Kausalität zwischen meinem Willen und der Welt. Heute misstraue ich all jenen Entscheidungen, die ich stets für richtig gehalten habe. Mein Selbstvertrauen, heute sowieso dahin, basierte viel zu lange auf der verdrängten Tatsache, dass die ursprüngliche Grundannahme ein fataler Irrtum gewesen war. Deshalb heiße ich heute alle eindeutig falschen Entscheidungen gut. Alles, was die trügerische Ambiguität absoluter Korrektheit verloren hat. Alles, was geschieht und alles, was der Fall ist reiner Zufall. Das hätte ich gleich zu Beginn wissen müssen, von Anfang an und in jedem folgenden Moment. Einmal wurde ich von meiner Mutter angekleidet, weil wir zu Täter Josefina wollten, und dann bat sie mich, im Eingangsflur unseres Hauses zu warten, während sie sich hübsch machte und mit Haarspray oder was auch immer einnebelte. Ich wartete. Aber irgendwann wurde mir langweilig und ich beschloss, mich möglichst weit über das Geländer zu lehnen, an dem ich mich festhielt, um auszutesten, ob ich meinen Körper darauf vor- und zurückschaukeln konnte. Dummerweise hatte ich die Schwerkraft nicht bedacht. Ich ahnte nicht, dass ich einfach vornüberkippen würde, doch genauso geschah es. Ich überschlug mich und hing mit verdrehten Handgelenken 3 Meter über dem Kellergeschoss. Meine Kräfte schwanden, meine Finger drohten abzurutschen, unter mir gähnte der Abgrund. Ich sah Chica Mustafas Tür, hoffte, er wäre zu Hause und schrie panisch um Hilfe. Damals war mir völlig klar, dass der Entschluss, auf dem Geländer zu schaukeln, vollkommen idiotisch gewesen war. Und weil ich sofort zu dieser Einsicht gelangte, kann dieser Entschluss weder einer irrigen Weltanschauung entsprungen sein, noch mein Leben in die falsche Richtung gelenkt haben. Der Entschluss, mich über das Geländer zu beugen, erwies sich so rasant und so eindeutig als falsch, dass es sich nicht um den eingangs erwähnten falschen Entschluss gehandelt haben kann, weil ich diesen, als ich ihn traf, zunächst für richtig gehalten haben muss. Ich stürzte, ich zerriss meine Hose, ich schlug mir die Knie auf. Der Sturz war nichts als ein Sturz. Und da war nichts anderes als Schmerz. Eine Aussage, die immer Sinn ergibt, weil sie über allen anderen Aussagen steht. Meine Mutter, die mich schreien hörte und nach unten eilte, fand mich verletzt und heulend vor Chica Mustafas Tür. Er war nicht zu Hause.
Aleksandar Hemon, this is a chapter about the overthrow of a worldview and, at the end, the fall from the balcony. And it is a true and tried method of comedy to put together the great and the small. And you know what? I believed your recollections of your own youth much less than the parents' book, but I enjoyed it much more.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I suppose it is the way we remember ourselves, particularly as children, is we remember ourselves with what we know about ourselves now, right? And so it's hard to remember what we didn't know back then. To remember what it felt like not to know such things. And so, in other words, we project the knowledge from the present into the past. And so I can't remember what I didn't know and how I didn't know it, right? Except at moments of rupture. If I fell off the balcony, right? Well, I can remember that I remember what I didn't know, that I didn't know that I shouldn't lean over the balcony, evidently. And so that when I was writing that and I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that the continuity between my knowledge now and my knowledge back then, right, which is in the narrative, it is narratized, it could be delusional. It could be delusional in that if I was wrong then about things, and if there's a continuity, I could still be wrong about things. And the way we shape our worldview, it's not quite objectively organizing the information and data that we receive as we live and exist in the world. It is really, we narratize those things. Our life is a story in which we are main characters, right? And so that works great in fiction, and it's very useful for fiction. I guess it's useful for mental health generally, because if there's no narrative, if it's broken up, it's very hard to live. But it also means that in some ways that your own life and who you are could be made up, and not even deliberately, but by mistake, right? So if the first premise, I was reading a lot of Wittgenstein around the time I was writing this book, and there are some quotes embedded from Wittgenstein. So I was interested in the idea that the whole operation was made on wrong premises. I liked Wittgenstein's algorithmic organization, the numbered arguments, one at a time. 1.1, 1.1.2, and so on. Sort of the building of an argument. And this is not something that we can really do in life in a conscious way, but we really do it. We construct an argument for the life that we live as the best possible life, right? Or whether by imagining what it could be, or if you're happy enough, you think, well, I am who I am because I couldn't be anyone else. But what if you could? And at which point was the choice or the turn made, right? And so I addressed that in that little chapter. It was interesting to me. It could be that I've been wrong about everything my entire life. Yes, that's not something that a young person would think, but a person of my age can begin to think that way.
So Wittgenstein, philosophical thought, and as well as we heard in the reading, pain and the body. The body is often mentioned as a storage of memories. But in other texts I read, you call yourself language fixated. How are the two related?
Well, they're directly related because there's no language outside the body, right? Really. I mean, you can write it, and in writing it exists outside the body, but it was produced by a body. Maybe with, AI now, artificial intelligence, machines can generate language, but that language will be detached from bodies. It'll be just information. What I'm saying right now is coming out of my body, right? And what I'm saying are my thoughts, which were produced in this big head, and following the laws of biology and physiology, if you wish. So I cannot imagine living outside my body. I cannot imagine thinking or speaking outside my body. And it is also, with all that, I guess it's a philosophical positioning. My body, because I'm aging rapidly, right now I have pain in my shoulder, right? And I have arthritis in my knee. Your body is always present. It cannot be suspended for thinking or feeling, right? So it is always there, and it's always there for me when I'm writing, both as an experience. My back hurts if I sit for too long, but also the memories that I like to use as fodder and material for my writing. They are memories and the body too, right? The whole notion of computer memory is nonsense. The computer does not remember anything. It just stores information, but the body doesn't just store information. It remembers, and remembering is a physical activity. It's not just a mental activity. And that is something that that interests me theoretically and conceptually, but it's also just experiential. I can never get out of thinking about that because that's what's happening to my body and myself, and I would think to everyone else.
Yeah. Aleksandar Hemon, all the best to your shoulder.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful and enjoyable conversation. And do me a favor, please. I mean, please don't stay with movies. Keep writing stories and novels. Thank you very much.